also a message, one of the main messages of the philosophy of existentialism. And in these years also, we start to see photographies like done by Dorothea Lange on the left, or Walter Evans on the right, which are photographies that that takes photos of what until a few years earlier, it would have been considered like a dirty reality. Why would you take a photo of just an agricultural field? Of course, for us, maybe for you, this doesn't make sense because now we are part of the generation where we are capable of enjoying it. But trust me, in the 50s, photos like this, they were really really experimental, because these photos of the one like Walter Evans, for instance, is about the ugliness, you know, the ugliness of, or the everyday ugliness of the main street in one of the many American towns. The same ugliness that Le Corbusier, if you remember well, in the 30s was actually highly criticizing through his more modernist approach. So obviously images like this are about the different types of aesthetic. And it's not by coincidence that in the same time I'm not going to talk about Andy Warhol, but Andy Warhol will be, for instance, and the pop art of Andy Warhol can be considered as an outcome, a later outcome of experiences of this kind. Now back to architecture. One of the main, one of the early main urban projects which is characterized, which is informed by the idea of existentialism, it is the Limban in central Rotterdam. The Limban, you can probably see the Limban is there. Sorry, there. So what we see here is what we see here. The Limban is the transformations of the town, and there is actually, I should say, historically, as a fact, there is lots to do in the Europe of the 50s. After many towns, especially in the Netherlands, in Germany, some in England, but not that many, but definitely France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, were destroyed by bombing during the war. So Rotterdam was one of them, and so there was a scope and an area to build up new projects. And this project here is a project that, for the first time, kind of innovative, in putting together very different types of activities. There are high-rise buildings next to, which you can see there, next to low buildings. There are pedestrian circulations, somehow intertwined with other arteries which are for car circulations. There are differences of uses together, residential, next to commercial, next to entertainment. And again, maybe for you this is not such a new thing in these days, but I can tell you, trust me, in the 50s this was pretty innovative, because this is one of the very first projects that start to integrate all different areas, whereas before the mentality was pretty much based still on the zoning. Zoning is a principle still somehow today pretty strong with urban planning, where you look at the plan of the city and you start to zone the city in different compartments. Compartment for industrial, compartment for parks, compartment for residential, and so on. Well, what the architects like, the one who designed the Limban, which are Bakeman and Van der Broek, did, and Bakeman and Van der Broek are also members of the Team 10 group, are trying to subvert, are trying to break down this mentality of the rigid subdivisions in urban fabric. And so we have integration, as I said before, between commercial, residential, open air, and pedestrian circulations. What you see from the photo on the left corner, that's a very interesting photo, obviously very staged, I suppose, by the photographer. It's not that the photographer just happened to have this family and children capturing the photo. You already wanted one, because that's another important message. Architecture has to be re-given back to the human beings. That's a message of existentialism. That's a message from design. Architecture doesn't need to be a metaphor of the machine. The architecture doesn't need to be really become obsessed with by being a metaphor of technology. And this was a message, and sometimes were accompanied by interesting outcomes. Sometimes this time is pretty difficult, because every time that there is a shift in generations, is also up and down. So there might be, and we'll see sometimes examples of architects who on the one hand are theorizing about with fondness about these principles, and yet have difficulties in really letting their work go, and still maybe are a bit too much into references like the Plan de Vue or the plan for Rio de Janeiro or the hyper infrastructure. But it takes time. Also in the Smithson's activity, the Smithsons, they theorized a lot, especially Allison. Allison was a gun. Allison was really the driving force. A fantastic, strong, well, according to some friends who mentored, she was fantastic. She was actually bitchy, but doesn't matter. That probably was needed to be so upfront. She was the one who was deciding who would participate at this meeting on the one. I imagine her saying to Peter, do that. Peter, do that. I do this. And she was the one who really edited the majority of the books. If you go to research under the Smithsons, you find so many different publications. I like and hate at the same time. I adore and hate at the same time these type of people. I love them because they are so generous in really putting themselves. They never say no. They are here and there. They participate in exhibitions. They paint something. They go to a movie. They write books. They organize meetings and so on. On the other hand, I hate them exactly for the same reason. But that's what's important. What's important in this lecture is to see that this principle of integrations are starting to be evident also in what we see in images taken from books. This is or projects at a smaller scale. This is a house designed by Aldo Van Eyck, another great architect and I should say, Team 10 was not an office, was not a group of people working every day together. Team 10 was a group of people who were running their own practice, doing their own research, and they were sometimes meeting in conferences or at the house of someone, or showing projects that they have begun, and all these are very often under the creations of Alison Smith. And what we see in these projects obviously is a space that is made up of so many different wholes. So we here encounter for the first time one of the most important principles of this time, which is the parts. The parts are into the whole, but the whole is a part itself. And so this generates, as you can imagine, a continuous, infinite circle, the whole in the parts and the parts is the whole. Aldo Van Eyck designed from the Second World War to much later, for a period of 30 so years, a series of playgrounds. Such a fantastic project. In the end, he designed, he probably did more than 100, I'm not sure. There is a book on the playgrounds in Amsterdam, done by Van Eyck. I just show you a few. They are interesting at many levels. They are interesting because they are fantastic examples of architecture, infrastructures, and treatment of open space. They are interesting historically because they redefine a city that was scarred by the war. So Amsterdam was one of the towns that had lots of leftover spaces as a result of the bombing. And this is one of them, for instance. Amsterdam also had the Jewish ghetto, so you can imagine the Jewish ghetto was really bombed quite heavily. And what Aldo Van Eyck, obviously together with an Enlightenment Council, because very often great architecture happens because there is a great politicians behind it. That's the story of Giancarlo De Carlo, which I will show you later. But here, some of the leftover spaces are reused. Sometimes ugly walls, leftover walls, are repainted and they become part of the landscape treatment. Sometimes it's by having a canopy. You see the two photos on the top that the canopy has been added on that vacant open space. Sometimes it's by refilling filling a vacant lot between houses, again left vacant because of bombing. But the other important thing of all this project is the children. You see, children, everything is made up of in the name of children now. There is this message that after the war, after the terrible years of the war, after the terrible years of the authoritarian mind you at the time the authoritarianism of communism in Russia was still going on, but some of the other authoritarian powers had been defeated, and then there was a hope to build again. But this hope, differently from the hope or the ideas of the Orthodox modernism, were not as utopian. Were much more, or let's say, probably that's not a very good word, because actually there are lots of utopian projects, but I would say were not as stringent, as somehow limited by the need advocated by early modernists to try to have architecture as a liberatory, as a revolutionary, as a devices for solving social problems. This is not a point anymore. This has been forgotten. Somehow through the war, this dream, this utopia is being washed out. And now architects engage with the leftover spaces, with whatever they found. Of course, sometimes there are still projects that are pretty visionary and pretty done on a very large territorial scale with the idea of controlling still a larger scale. But the trend is to go from the 50s to the 60s, 70s, and the 90s, more and more towards the reevaluations of the city as a found. This will become even more evident through the Italian neorealism and the Italian neorealism. So these are interesting, very interesting points, because if you think about existentialism, which is about how we consider ourselves, how we start to think of ourselves as phenomenon among phenomena, just to repeat what I said last Wednesday by showing the kids, the children on the roof of the Unité d'Habitation. Well, that's really a strong point of the philosophy of existentialism, and in this you can find this point somehow translated into architecture, into the way to which these architects are approaching architecture in urban space. Then there are other more positive consequences of this series of projects. For instance, you see that spaces that originally, before the war, were very large and totally devoted to the traffic, to the car circulation, so they get now reacquired by spaces that are used by pedestrians. And that's another great difference. If you think of Le Corbusier dreaming of having cars driving all over the buildings, and if we look at whereas now cars, the space for cars that is actually reduced, increasingly reduced, because the city is to become the city for pedestrians. And after all, if you think about, we live our life, and that's one of my main points every time I speak with my students, we live our life by walking, by by walking the majority of our time, or anyway by being in touch with the ground. This is why I can really sympathize with architects who always have this myth of being in airports and flying here and there as if the life was in airplanes. Of course, there are architects who spend a lot of time in airplanes, but still I really just more time in walking and being on the ground. This is our conditions, to be creatures of the ground. And to be creatures of the ground means that we, as architects, need to be in touch with the space we are experiencing every day, every time, more than the building. This is why I like to share this approaches with you as also symptomatic of the approach I'm trying to describe today. And so the stories go on. There are many, some, as I say, that are actually the same. Coming back to the idea of the core and the path, the core and the path, or the whole and the path. Well, this is a very famous diagram that was published in one of the magazines edited by Van Eyck. It's called the leaf tree diagram. As you can see there, he says tree is a leaf is a tree, house is a tree, house is a city. It's almost like the nursery rhyme, but it is pretty symptomatic. He's trying to break down the idea of hierarchy between things and trying to advocate for circularity between things. It's exactly the same as what I was saying before about the relationship between the whole and the parts. Yes, we have the parts, which altogether make the whole, but then if each of the parts is a whole in itself, then each of the parts is made up of many other parts, which are whole at the same time. There is a very beautiful article by Cacciari, actually, which is a more contemporary updated versions of this, and if you want to read this in a much more philosophical way, I think it's called, well, I can't find it, so I can't remember. I might find it later. But it's also something that is about the impossibility to define some limits, some sense of separations, in the ways they are described in one of the other, probably one of the more famous philosophical texts for architects, which is the one written by Heidegger called the Building Dwelling Thing, written in 1951, same years of these diagrams. And interestingly, this is the time where philosophers like Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger himself, Sartre, they're all talking about existentialism, and they say things like the space of dwelling is not a geometrical but an existential one, resulting from our phenomenological perceptions of place, and its construction is grounded in experience. So this is very, very different from, again, some architects who just in the 30s were talking about architecture as the perfect outcome of the sum of pieces as if it was a machine. And it's definitely at the opposite end of an idea that advocates the possibility of us as human beings being in charge of the world. Obviously, through existentialism, we are actually trying, if you read Sartre, if you read Merleau-Ponty, what the suggestion there is to actually lose yourself in the world of phenomena, not to find yourself through ignorance in the world. The image on the right is another very beautiful photo that was taken, by some people dancing, which is about the continuity of the soul. All these images are also the starting point for architecture that, as we'll see, will work more and more with diagrams that are about clustering shapes, branching forms, and things that are working organically in a way, trying to reiterate the idea that through certain types of organisms you then have the circularity between the parts and the whole. And this is one of the many meetings with them. You see Peter's meetings there with the third one on the left. Giancarlo De Carlo, probably smoking. I can see also smoking. Then there is Michael, can't remember his name. Then there is Bachema. Van Eyck is the one on the very corner. You see the white, beautiful hair of Van Eyck. And obviously Alison Smithson's there, already checking. Pretty nervous and pretty present. The only woman you can imagine. Still today's women apparently have to calculate their dimensions in the world of architecture, not just architecture. Can you imagine in the 50s? So you need really to be a tiger like she did. And she was really right. In fact, Peter Smithson, when he was interviewed, when they were asking him his CV, he was always saying, I'm just the husband. It's a line that I